night boat of the cove. On the quietest stretch of the western coast, where the green meadows descended patiently to kiss the dark sand, there was a cove that appeared on no merchant's map and in no song of hurried sailors. The local fishermen knew it, of course, but they rarely spoke its name. They called it, in low voices, the Cove of the Loosened Dream, because they said that the sea in that sheltered corner did not push thoughts aside, but untied them one by one until they floated like waterweed on a gentle current. In a village of whitewashed houses and thatched roofs, not far from that shore, there lived a young woman named Aithne. She had hands skilled at the loom, eyes that followed the flight of seabirds closely, and an ancient weariness that did not match her age. During the day, she moved with the calm of someone who knows how to see each task through. She helped her aunt spread the nets. She carded wool by the fire. She drew water from the well. She tied small bunches of thyme and heather to dry by the window. She spoke little, smiled gently, and always listened to the end when the elders told stories of enchanted seals, hollow hills, or fires that burned alone on Samhain night. But when darkness fell and the last candle was reduced to a golden ember, rest did not come to her. Sleep drifted through the house. It brushed the rafters. It came down the chimney in the scent of the peat. It settled on her aunt's shoulders as she dozed in the rocking chair. It tangled in the legs of the dog, already asleep on the warm floor. It nestled in the nests under the eaves. Everyone's eyelids closed, soft and heavy as damp petals. Everyone's but hers. Aithne would lie on the straw mattress and listen to the whole house breathe. The faint creak of the wood, the brush of rain against the walls on some nights. The murmur of the sea, always present, coming in through the window like a distant voice that never quite finished speaking. She closed her eyes. She counted her own exhalations. She recalled old songs. She repeated the names of flowers, of stars, of river stones, and yet something in her chest stayed awake. It was not fear, it was not pain. It was a kind of edgeless wakefulness, a clarity too fine that kept her afloat when all she wanted was to sink softly into the gentle darkness of rest. Many months passed this way. The village people, who knew remedies for almost everything, offered her all they knew. The widow Mairead gave her warm milk with heather honey. Old Ronan prepared a wild poppy tisane as gentle as mist. A woman come from the north braided her a blue ribbon to place under her pillow. A traveling monk blessed a smooth stone and pressed it to her chest. Nothing did any harm, nothing worked entirely. "Don't chase sleep," her aunt told her once, shaking crumbs from the tablecloth at dusk. "There are birds that only come close when you look away." Aithne nodded because the advice was good and old, but she did not know how to follow it. There were mornings when dawn found her sitting in the doorway, wrapped in a grey shawl, watching the horizon lighten. In those moments she felt a strange peace, almost luminous, as if the night had finally let her go. Yet her body felt heavy. Her arms moved more slowly. Words took longer to arrive, sometimes bending down to gather dried seaweed on the beach. She felt that the whole world was breathing in a way she had forgotten. It was on one of those dawns, at the beginning of autumn, that the boat appeared. The tide had risen silently during the night. Then it had withdrawn with the same care, leaving along the sand strings of foam, mother of pearl shells, and ribbons of dark wrack. The mist still lay low over the water, and the sun was nothing but a pale brightness behind a white veil. Aithne had come down to the shore alone, a basket empty on her arm, intending to gather driftwood. She walked slowly, listening beneath her steps to the crunch of the wet pebbles. Then she saw it. It was not run aground the way wreckage from a storm arrives. It was not overturned or damaged. It rested on the exact line where a small wave came to kiss the sand and withdrew at once, as though the sea wanted to touch it again and again without ever carrying it away. It was a narrow, elongated boat, made of wood so pale it seemed to have been polished by moonlight. It had no oars, no sail, no rope, no name painted on the side. It seemed not so much built as remembered. Aithne set the basket on the ground and approached carefully. The wood was dry despite the sea foam. Leaning over, she caught a faint, clean smell like rain on stone and apple leaves. She ran her fingertips along the rim. She felt no roughness at all. In the bottom of the boat, there was a single blanket of dark blue wool folded with care, and a smooth white stone, round and even, placed in the bow. She looked one way and then the other. There was no one, only the murmur of the tide, only the mist, only the gulls, still silent. She thought about calling someone from the village. She thought about stepping back. She even considered it might be a vision born of exhaustion. But the boat was there, as clear as her own hands. And there was in it a stillness so deep, so free of any threat that Aithne felt no fear. She felt recognition, as though she had been waiting a long time for something without knowing what shape it would take when it arrived. She sat on a nearby rock to watch it. The morning moved on a little. The mist parted into veils. The water took on a color of silver and green, yet the boat did not shift its place. A wave came, a wave went. The pale wood barely rocked. Aithne lifted her gaze to the horizon. As a child, she had heard tales of boats from the other side, curraghs that crossed through the mist, laden with music, with red apples, or with travelers who did not age. But those stories always came with warnings. Do not follow unknown lights. Do not accept food beneath the hills. Do not board a boat no one rows if you still wish to live among your own. And yet no tale she could remember looked quite like this, because that boat was not calling to her. It was waiting. The difference was small, but in the heart it was very much felt. She went home with the basket nearly empty and kept silent all morning. While she combed the wool, she thought of the pale wood. While she stoked the fire, she heard in her memory the faint brush of water against the hull. While she ate a piece of oat bread with fresh cheese, she saw again and again the white stone placed in the bow, like a small point of moonlight. As evening fell, when the sky turned the color of burnished pewter, and the sheep were already brought in, she went back to the cove. The boat was still there. It seemed closer to the shore, though no mark showed its movement. The tide moved around it carefully, as if it knew its place better than anyone. Aithne stood for a long while, the shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. The air smelled of salt, fresh seaweed, and damp earth. From somewhere far away came the sound of a small bell, perhaps a goat, perhaps the wind playing in some ironwork. Then, giving herself no other reason than the calm itself, she took off her shoes, hitched up her dress, and waded through the shallow water until she touched the side of the boat again. She climbed in slowly, expecting it to creak, to tilt, for water to come in somewhere. None of that happened. The wood received her like a steady hand. She sat on the blue blanket. The boat rocked once. Then it was as still as a leaf suspended in air. Aithne held the rim with both hands and looked back toward the shore. It was still there, close. She could step out whenever she wished. That gave her the courage to stay. She took the white stone from the bow. It was warm, not warm as things left in the sun, but warm as things that have rested a long time in kind hands. The boat moved, not forward or back at first. It simply breathed beneath her, if a boat can do such a thing. It sank just a little. It rose just a little, like a sleeping chest. Aithne felt the rocking and, almost without thinking, breathed in. The boat moved a handspan out to sea. She held her breath in surprise. The hull went still. She breathed out slowly, uncertainly. The boat moved another handspan. Aithne opened her eyes wide. She looked around. There was no visible current to explain that gliding. No hidden oars, no folded sail. Only the gentle water, the grey sky, and her own breath. She tried again. She breathed in very slowly, as if filling her chest with the evening mist. The boat answered with a gentle rocking. She breathed out longer. The hull slid forward once more, silently, moving into the cove with the serenity of someone who knows the way by heart. A small, surprised smile appeared on Aithne's face. It had been a long time since anything had given her a joy so clean. She kept breathing. She didn't know if anyone was watching from the village. She didn't think about it. Nor did she think about tales or warnings. All her attention settled into the simple rhythm of the experiment. Take in air, feel the gentle rise of the chest. Let it go. Notice how the boat, docile and alive, responded to the letting go of her breath. Soon she discovered something more. If she breathed in quickly, the movement became brief and restless, like a gust, ruffling the surface of a pond. If she released the air in fragments, the boat seemed to hesitate, making small adjustments, as if inviting her to find a gentler pulse. But when she breathed in without effort and breathed out slowly, long and round, the hull rocked with such natural perfection that the whole sea seemed to fall into rhythm with her. It was this way that she reached the center of the cove. The shore lay a little distance away, wrapped in the first blues of nightfall. The village houses were pale shapes among the tall grass. The bell stopped sounding. An early star appeared above the dark outline of a hill. Aithne noticed then that the cold was not touching her. The blue blanket spread over the floor of the boat seemed to hold a delicate warmth. She settled herself more comfortably on it, the white stone between her hands. She breathed. The boat answered, and for the first time in many months, Aithne felt that her body was not fighting the night. It was learning from it. The water did not hurry. No wave tried to teach anything by force. Each movement began, rounded itself, and ended without abruptness. Rise, fall, take, release. Even the light seemed to obey that law, fading so slowly that you could not say at which exact moment the grey became blue, and the blue became dark silver. Aithne let go of the rim. She leaned back. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she did, the sound of the sea changed, not because the sea had changed, but because she had begun to hear it differently. No longer as a distant, restless murmur, but as a succession of vast breaths. The wave coming in was an inhalation, the wave withdrawing an exhalation. The water over the pebbles was a whisper between the two. And her chest, which so many nights had felt like a stranger to all of this, began to follow it with a new humility. Like a child who, after losing the song, finds the refrain again. She did not know how much time passed. Perhaps only a few minutes, perhaps a whole hour, soft as a cloth. When she opened her eyes again, the moon had risen above the line of the sea. It was not full, it was a curved moon with a clean edge, making the ripples of the water gleam like scales of pewter. Then the boat turned on its own, not abruptly. It turned with the unhurried ease of a fallen leaf finding at last the direction of the stream. Aithne felt no alarm. She understood, without words, that the journey of that first night was over. She breathed in, she breathed out. The boat made its way back to shore at the same rhythm with which it had set out. When it touched the sand, the keel barely made a sound. Aithne stepped down barefoot. The water wrapped around her ankles, cold and alive. She turned to look at the boat one more time. The pale wood seemed even paler now under the moon. She left the white stone in the bow and folded the blanket with the same care with which she had found it, though it seemed to her that the wool had kept the shape of her body. She walked home with a quiet heart. She did not tell herself she would sleep. She made no promises or pleas. She went in quietly. She added a peat brick to the fire so the embers would last until dawn. She took off her damp dress and lay down on the mattress, listening to her aunt breathe on the other side of the room. She closed her eyes. She remembered the movement of the boat. Not the image, but the movement. Take in air, let it go. And sleep came. It did not fall on her like a sudden spell. It came the way the sea enters the cove, without noise, without insisting, rising little by little, until it covered her thoughts. The last thing she felt was a gratitude so light it was almost like a feather resting in the center of her chest. The next morning she woke to golden light on her hands and the sound of her aunt grinding oats in a wooden bowl. She lay still for a moment, surprised by the breadth of the rest. She had slept. Not a broken doze, not a few minutes forgetting, but a whole sleep, deep and smooth. Her mind was clear. Her bones felt soft. The world seemed freshly washed. Her aunt looked at her and smiled before Aithne said a word. "Your eyes have the stillness of a lake today," she said. Aithne wanted to tell her everything. The boat, the stone, the movement guided by breath. But something inside advised her to keep the story a little longer, the way you keep a warm seed cupped in your hand before planting it. So she simply bowed her head and helped with breakfast. That night she went back to the cove. And the next night too. The boat was always there, waiting in the same strip of water where the tide kissed the sand. It never drifted away on its own. It never appeared anywhere else. Aithne began to understand that its presence did not depend on chance, but on a deeper kind of calling, a voiceless call made of true need and patient listening. Each afternoon after finishing her work, she walked to the shore with a small ritual no one knew about. She washed her hands in the water of a spring at the foot of the path. She picked up a fallen leaf or a feather or a particular pebble from the track and left it on the shore the way you greet a place. Then she went to the boat, climbed in, took the white stone and let the sea teach her. Gradually, she noticed changes. The first was in her breathing itself. Before, without realizing, she used to hold it high and shallow, as if only a small part of her chest dared to inhabit the air. In the boat, she learned to breathe with her whole body, with her ribs, with her belly, even with her back against the smooth wood. The air came in, fresh and silent, and when it left, it seemed to carry with it small threads of weariness, small invisible knots that had been tied for a long time. The second change came in her nights. She no longer dreaded lying down. The bed was still the same. The house still creaked in the same way. The sea still murmured behind the windows. But now when she closed her eyes, Aithne no longer felt she had to hunt sleep or chase it through inner corridors. She only remembered the water. She remembered how the whole world knows how to rock without hurry what it loves. And the rest came sometimes sooner, sometimes later, but always more gently. The third change was harder to name. It was that wakefulness stopped being her enemy. In the days before, each afternoon had dragged behind it the secret fear of another sleepless night. That fear had been seeping into the daylight hours, draining their color, thickening them. Now, knowing that the cove would be waiting when the sun went down, Aithne began to see small things differently. The smoke rising straight from the rooftops at dawn, the reddish glint of seaweed drying on the rocks, the sound of wool tightening on the loom, the way a cup holds warmth between the hands. Everything seemed part of the same slow learning. One afternoon, while she was descending the path toward the sea, she found old Breik beside the way. The old woman lived alone in a cottage covered in honeysuckle and knew more names of herbs and tides than anyone in the region. She had white hair, a curved back, and grey eyes so luminous they always seemed to hold the reflection of water. "You move more lightly," the old woman observed without any greeting first. The way people do who already live very close to plain truth. Aithne smiled. "I've been sleeping better." Brag nodded slowly as if that answer confirmed something she already knew. "Sometimes sleep hasn't been lost," she said. "Sometimes it has only moved to another shore and waits for us to cross to it differently." Aithne felt a gentle shiver. "You know the cove?" she asked, The old woman lifted her eyes toward the blue strip of sea visible between the gorse and the ferns. I have known it since before you were born, and before your mother was born. There are places where the world breathes closer to itself. In those places, someone who listens with patience can remember old things, not stories necessarily, sometimes only rhythms. Aithne wanted to ask about the boat. She wanted to know if others had seen it, whether it belonged to the fairy folk, whether it was a gift or a test. But Bri placed a light hand on her wrist, and that gesture seemed to contain already a sufficient answer. Not everything that helps needs to be explained at once, the old woman murmured. First receive, then understand if you must. There are gifts that grow cloudy when too much. Light is put on them. Aithne bowed her head, grateful. She continued on her way to the coast with the strange feeling that of being guided not by a dangerous secret, but by an ancient kindness, larger than any explanation. That night, when she climbed into the boat, she found something different. Beside the white stone, there was a sprig of rowan with 3 red berries, bright as small drops of fire. They had not been there the evening before. Aithne took it between her fingers. It seemed neither freshly cut nor faded. It seemed perfect, suspended in a moment where ripeness and freshness were the same thing. She sat, laid the sprig on the blanket, and began to breathe. The boat moved forward with its usual docility. But when it reached the center of the cove, it did not stop. It continued on, slowly, toward where the water opened onto the wide sea. Aithne felt no alarm. The moon was growing night by night, and its path of light stretched across the waves like a road of veiled silver. The air was still. The rocking was still safe, almost maternal. She breathed a little more deeply. La costa se alejó. Then she heard singing. It was not a nearby voice, nor did it seem to come from any precise point. Rather, it floated on the surface of the water and beneath it at the same time, as though the sea were singing with a throat made of mist. The melody had no words Aithne could have repeated, but its meaning was clear in a way that does not pass through the tongue. It was a lullaby, a song that did not try to put anyone to sleep by force, but to remind them how to let themselves be held. The young woman closed her eyes. Her exhale grew longer than ever before. In the boat, time lost its edges. The song continued. The sea rose and fell. Her breathing found a new depth. And somewhere between the sound of the water and the curve of the moon, Aithne understood the first true lesson of the oarless boat. Dormir no era caer, dormir era confiar. With that gentle understanding settling in her chest like a small, warm ember, Aithne let the boat move a little farther across the still skin of the sea. There was no hurry in the movement, no destination marked by lighthouses or visible shores, only the continuity of the water, the quiet light of the moon, and that wordless song that seemed woven from mist, from sea foam, and from the ancient memories of the world. The boat did not cut through the waves. Rather, it seemed to glide between them as though the water recognized it. Aithne rested a hand on the smooth rim and felt beneath the wood a subtle vibration like the silent purring of something alive and serene. The rowan sprig rested beside her. The 3 red berries glowed softly in the half-dark, as though keeping inside them a reflection of hearth. Respiró otra vez. When she breathed in, the air smelled of salt and distance. When she breathed out, the song grew clearer. It was not a sad melody, nor a cheerful one in the light way of festive songs. It was a round, patient music, made to accompany, a music that did not push the heart toward any violent feeling, but gradually untangled it, the way wise fingers untangle a wet thread without breaking it. Aithne felt, for the first time in a long while, that there were places inside her that were beginning to loosen. She thought about the sleepless nights, about how each thought had always come after the last, without rest, like startled birds taking flight from the same bush. She thought about the effort she had made for months to reach sleep, as though sleep were a closed door that had to be forced open with persistence. And there, rocked by a boat that obeyed only her breathing, she understood that her exhaustion did not come only from not sleeping. It came also from having fought too hard. The sea seemed to have always known it. A low mist began to gather on the surface of the water. It was not thick. It did not hide the world. It only made its edges softer. The horizon line blurred. The moon, seen through that veil, looked like a lamp hanging in an immense and silent room. Aithne felt no unease. On the contrary, there was something profoundly kind in that way of dissolving edges, as if the night were teaching her that not everything had to be sharp to be safe. Poco después vio, a cierta distancia, tres luces pequeñas. They floated on the water, barely above the mist. They did not flicker like lanterns carried by human hands, nor did they shine with the cold brilliance of stars. They were warm lights, like candles sheltered behind frosted glass. They stayed still as the boat moved toward them at the pace of her breathing. Aithne remembered old warnings. Do not follow strange lights over the sea. Do not answer voices that call your name from the mist. Do not give your course to what you do not understand. But those lights did not draw closer. They did not call to her. They did not try to lure her with urgency. They were simply there, the way the boat was there when she found it. Available, silent, imposing nothing. When she drew close, she understood they were not flames. Aran floors, 3 white irises floating on the water with no visible stem, open under the moon, each with a pale gold center that gave off that serene brightness. The boat stopped level with them. The song of the sea grew quiet, or perhaps grew so delicate it was almost indistinguishable from silence. Aithne reached toward the nearest flower but did not touch it. She felt she should not take it from its place. She simply gazed at it. In its petals there was a damp, pearlescent sheen. The water beneath it had no threatening depth. It seemed a dark mirror, infinite and gentle. Then, without anyone speaking, a memory came to her. It was not like remembering with the mind. It was more like when an old scent suddenly awakens in an entire room of the heart. She saw herself as a child, very small, lying in her mother's lap while outside the rain struck the thatched roof. She remembered the weight of a thick blanket over her legs. She remembered her mother's hand on her back, rising and falling with a perfect slowness. She remembered a song murmured almost without voice. She could not recover its words, but she could the rhythm, the cadence, the absolute certainty of being safe. Los ojos se le llenaron de lágrimas, aunque no eran lágrimas amargas. Her mother had passed to the other side when Aithne was not yet old enough to hold on to many clear details. She retained some gestures, certain glimpses of laughter, the way she braided her hair, the smell of lavender soap on her hands. But that feeling of warm support and shared breath had stayed hidden in a region so deep that Aithne had not known it was still there. The boat, the sea, and the night seemed to have gone looking for it. She breathed in slowly, with tenderness. She let it go even more slowly, and she understood another small and luminous truth. Perhaps the body never entirely forgets how to fall asleep when it has been put to sleep with love. The nearest flower turned gently on itself. Then, without wilting or sinking, it gradually lost its brightness until it was almost transparent. The other two did the same. In a few moments there was only the water again, smooth and dark, as though the irises had been nothing but a momentary revelation of something that always lives below the surface. The boat continued on its way. This time it moved in a slow curve, as if following an invisible current. The mist opened a little, and Aithne made out a stretch of sea in total calm. So still it seemed to belong not to the ocean, but to a secret lake spread above it. When she entered that zone, the rocking changed. It was no longer the delicate sway of small waves. It was something even more unhurried, like the breathing of someone deeply asleep. Subir, descender, una larga quietud entre ambos movimientos. Aithne let her shoulders drop. She relaxed her jaw, her brow, her hands. She understood that there were muscles in her body that had been clenched for months without her noticing. And as the water went on, teaching her that deeper rhythm, those places released one by one, like knots in an old net that finally touches warm water. She did not know whether she was fully awake or already entering a sweet form of sleep. She heard the song. She felt the faint dampness of the night on her eyelashes. She saw the moon diffuse above the mist. But at the same time, there was a dreaming quality to everything, as if the world were very close and very far at once. Entonces la oyó. No era el mar esta vez. It was a human voice, old and clear, that seemed to come from somewhere behind the mist. El agua no retiene aquello que sabe mecer. Aithne opened her eyes fully and raised her head. She saw no one, only the mist glowing faintly under the moon. The voice came again, calm, with no sharp mystery to it, as if continuing an old conversation. Quien se abandona al ritmo correcto no se pierde, se encuentra descansando. The young woman felt no fear. She recognized in that voice the same kind of truth that was in Broy's words, the old woman of the honeysuckle cottage. Perhaps it was her, perhaps not. Perhaps some voices travel in ways that need no paths of earth. I have been afraid of never being able to sleep again, Aithne whispered, without thinking whether she was speaking to the air, the sea, or herself. The answer came with the same gentleness. And that fear would sit beside you every night. You made room for it on the pillow. You tucked it in without meaning to. Aithne cerró un momento los ojos. Era verdad. She had feared wakefulness so much that when she lay down, she already carried in her body the echo of the coming sleeplessness. Every night began before it began. Every shadow on the wall filled with anticipation. Every silence became an announcement. She had turned the absence of sleep into an expected visitor. Respiró, lenta. The water beneath the boat rose and fell. La voz añadió, no invites a la orilla aquello que deseas dejar mar adentro. Aithne felt the words settle inside her with a quiet clarity, like a white stone placed in a bowl. For a long while there were no more words, none were needed. The boat turned slowly and began its return. The shore was still invisible, but the young woman noticed the change in the water, a little more alive, a little saltier in the air. She kept her breath long and round. Each exhale seemed to light the way a few steps further. When the mist began to lift, she saw again the dark line of the low cliffs, the grass-covered hills, and beyond them, the warm glow of 2 or 3 windows in the village. They had never seemed so welcoming to her, never so enough. The boat touched the sand with the same delicacy as a hand settling on a feverish forehead. Aithne descendió sin prisa. Antes de marcharse, dejó la ramita de cerval junto a la piedra blanca, en la proa. Al hacerlo, notó que la madera estaba tibia, como la primera vez. Inclinó la cabeza, no exactamente en reverencia, sino en gratitud. Climbing the path toward her house, she realized she was no longer trying to hold on to the experience. She was not thinking about how to repeat it perfectly. She was not afraid of losing it. She carried it in her body, in the length of the exhale, in the new softness of her shoulders, in the way her steps fell on the earth without hurry. That night, when she lay down, she heard the sea behind the walls and smiled in the dark. No llamó al sueño, le abrió espacio. And sleep, recognizing at last a home without struggle, crept in on quiet feet and stayed with her until dawn. Los días empezaron a ordenarse de una manera nueva alrededor de aquel rito callado. The tasks did not change. The wet nets were no lighter, nor the work at the loom any shorter. The wind kept coming in from the Atlantic with its clean scent of salt and rain. The hens kept waking too early. The peat kept leaving fine ash in the hearth. And yet everything seemed to have found a deeper music. Aithne worked with the feeling that each thing had its natural time, and that the body, when it stops fighting the night, also learns to move differently through the day. Sometimes she hummed without noticing. She did not fully know the melody. It was only a few bars that dissolved at once, like foam on the rocks. But her aunt would look up when she heard it and smile with an expression of old tenderness. "Your mother used to sing that when it rained several days in a row," she said one morning, as they hung washed clothes in the shelter of the stone wall. "I haven't heard it in a very long time." Aithne went still with a sheet between her hands. The white cloth billowed a little in the wind. "I didn't remember it," she murmured. "The heart remembers before the memory does," her aunt replied. That phrase accompanied her all day, while she stirred a pot of thick oatmeal, while she patiently separated fish bones, while she raised a bucket from the well, watching the water reflect a patch of sky between clouds. The heart remembers before the memory does. It seemed true to her. There were things thought could not reach, but the body knew how to find rest, how to loosen, how to recognize a song heard when she was still very small. That afternoon, when she went down to the cove, the sea was different. Not rough, not dark, only fuller of voice. A very fine rain had passed during the afternoon, and the air held that green and mineral smell that lingers in meadows after water. On the wet sand, the pebbles shone as though each one had been polished by hand. The boat waited where it always did, rocked by small, close-packed waves that reflected a pearl-colored sky. Aithne climbed in and wrapped herself in the blue blanket. The white stone was in the bow, but that night there was also a small spiral shell, cream-colored, placed beside it. She took it between her fingers. It was light, perfect, with a delicate pattern that turned inward again and again. She lifted it to her ear for the pleasure of it, the way children do. Why Oyo Mar? Not the nearby sea of the cove, but a vastly deeper breathing, low and serene, as though the shell held the echo of ancient waters, of tides that had touched remote shores before arriving here. She smiled. She set the shell beside the blanket and began to breathe. The boat moved slowly into the bay. That night the water did not carry her toward the flowers or toward the open mist of the wide sea. It carried her along the coast, following the line where the low cliffs grew gentler and opened into small hidden coves. Aithne had known that coast since childhood, but from the water everything was different. The rocks seemed taller, the patches of heather darker. The folds of the land revealed themselves like the inside of a large, ancient hand. The light faded without hurry. A few seabirds passed overhead with nearly motionless wings and disappeared toward the northern islets. Far away, in the grass of a hill, a domestic fire lit for a moment and then was hidden. The whole world seemed to gather itself in. Respirar y dejarse llevar. Respirar y no preguntar demasiado. The boat rounded a small rocky point where clumps of sea fennel grew and entered a cove so narrow that Aithne could not remember ever having seen it from the land. It was sheltered by 2 arms of stone, covered in pale lichen. Inside, the water was smooth as a sheet of smoked glass. The sound of the open sea arrived muffled, reduced to a low murmur almost womb-like. At the back of the cove there was a small round beach of pale sand, and behind it began a small wood of rowans and silver birches. The boat stopped in the center of that stillness. Aithne sat up slightly, without breaking the rhythm of her breathing. Something about that place felt familiar and strange at once, as if it belonged not to the map of the village, but to the map of things dreamed many times without knowing it. Entonces vio movimiento entre los árboles. It was not an abrupt appearance. First a trembling in the leaves, then a soft brightness between the trunks. Then very slowly a figure came out of the wood and moved to the water's edge. Era una cierva blanca. Not completely white like snow. Its coat had the tones of mist, of milk warmed by a fire, of pale ash under the moon. Its hooves seemed not to sink into the sand. It raised its head and looked toward the boat with dark, deep, tranquil eyes. Aithne went still. In the village there were stories about deer of the fairy folk, messengers from forests that do not always appear in the same place, guardians of paths that only open to those who are ready to see them. As a child, those stories had seemed beautiful and a little distant to her. Now, with the water still and her breathing measured, she did not feel she was before something fantastic in the sense of the unbelievable. She felt, rather, that she was before a natural piece of a wider world than the days usually hold. The deer dipped its head once, then it turned toward the wood and took a few steps. It stopped. It looked back. It waited. There was no clearer invitation, and at the same time no freer one. The boat glided toward the beach as if responding to a gentle thought. Aithne stepped down into the shallow water and felt the cold sand beneath her feet. The deer waited at the edge of the small wood. When the young woman was close enough to make out the fine shadows of its lashes over those dark eyes, the animal moved on. Aithne la siguió. The floor of the wood was covered in damp leaves and moss. There was a clean smell of wet bark, fungi, and ripe berries. Between the branches, a few raindrops still remained, and now and then one fell with a faint sound onto the ferns. The deer moved without noise, choosing a barely visible path that wound between the white trunks of the birches. Aithne followed it calmly. She felt no fear. Each step seemed to receive her before she took it. She soon noticed something remarkable. The forest was breathing, not like a creature, but like a living space that expanded and gathered in a slow rhythm. When Aithne breathed in, the leaves seemed to raise their brightness a little, and the trunks grew sharper. When she breathed out, the edges softened, and the path seemed to lengthen just slightly. It was not a change visible to a hurried eye. It was a delicate correspondence, an affinity. The deer led her to a circular clearing. In the center grew an ancient hawthorn, not very tall but wide, with twisted branches and dark bark thick with silver moss. Beneath it, the grass was shorter and softer, as if the place itself invited rest. Among the roots, 3 smooth stones stood out, placed in such a way that they formed a half moon. La cierva se detuvo junto al árbol. Aithne stood in silence. A gentle wind moved through the top of the hawthorn and let fall 2 yellow leaves. They turned slowly in the air and settled just in front of her. Then she understood that she should sit. She settled herself on the grass, inside the half moon of stones, legs folded, hands in her lap. The deer watched her a moment longer, then it lay down before her on the moss, folding its legs with a slow, perfect grace. For a long while, nothing more happened, and yet something deep was happening. Aithne respiraba, the deer breathed. The whole forest seemed to follow that same rhythm. The hawthorn with its still branches, the dampness in the air, the soft darkness between the trunks. Even the silence had a pulse. Aithne realized that until then, she had understood breathing as a key for moving the boat and summoning sleep. But here she was beginning to glimpse something else. Breathing was not only a gesture of the body, it was a way of belonging, a form of coming into accord with what surrounded her. She closed her eyes. She felt the earth beneath her, firm and kind. She felt the coolness of the moss through her dress. She felt that each inhale received something more than air. It received space, stillness, permission. And each exhale did not release only weariness. It also released that habit of hers of holding herself up inside even when it was not needed. She did not know how long she stayed like that. When she opened her eyes, the clearing seemed brighter even though night must have been falling. The deer was still there. On one of the stones of the half moon there had appeared a small cup of hazel wood filled to the brim with clear water. Aithne took it with both hands. The water smelled of nothing but freshness. She drank a sip. It was cold and sweet, with a faint taste of green apple and early rain. As it went down her throat, she felt a peace so clear that she had to close her eyes again. It was not drowsiness, not exactly. It was a form of wakeful rest, of repose without loss. When she looked again, the deer had risen to its feet. It moved toward her slowly. It touched its muzzle to Aithne's forehead, just between the brows, in a gesture so light it was almost like a wisp of mist. Then it turned and moved into the birches until it disappeared without a single sound. Aithne was left alone in the clearing. Sola, pero no abandonada. She looked down at the hazel cup. It was empty now. She set it carefully at the foot of the hawthorn and stood up. At that moment she heard, from far away, the sound of water touching the small beach of the cove. The boat was waiting. She returned along the path almost without noticing she was walking. The wood seemed to guide her with an ancient delicacy. When she came out from among the trees, the moon had just appeared above the rocks. The boat floated motionless near the shore, pale and faithful. Aithne climbed in, wrapped herself again in the blanket, and let her breathing carry her back to the cove. As she moved through the night water, with the spiral shell still holding inside it the murmur of remote seas, she understood the lesson of that night. Rest did not begin when one fell asleep. It began much earlier. It began in the moment the body truly believed it no longer had to watch over everything. From that night on, Aithne began to notice the small watchfulnesses that had previously gone undetected. No eran solo las de la cama. They were the body's vigilances during the day. The way she tensed her shoulders when she heard a door close with force. The way she held her breath when thinking of an unfinished task. The faint tightening of her fingers when a dark cloud suddenly covered the field and threatened rain over the hanging laundry. None of it seemed serious. They were barely small gestures, habits of the body. But in seeing them, she understood that she had been living for a long time like someone listening for a distant sound that may never come, yet never stops waiting for it. The boat was teaching her something else. It was teaching her that rest begins when watchfulness softens. It does not disappear entirely. Human beings, Aithne thought, always keep a part awake. Someone must tend the fire. Someone must attend to the tides, the changes in the sky, the health of the animals, the quiet grief of a neighbor. But between being attentive and remaining tense, there was an enormous difference. And that difference, night by night, became clearer to her than the line between sea and sand. With that new understanding, the young woman began to move differently through the village. When she went to the well, she no longer pulled up the bucket in a hurry. She listened to the scrape of the rope, the hollow knock of the wood touching the water. She waited a moment before raising it, as if letting the well finish its breathing. When she wove, she did not force the rhythm of the loom. She let the shuttle run with an even cadence, almost like the stroke of an ordinary oar, though the boat waiting for her at nightfall needed none. When she kneaded bread with her aunt, she discovered that the dough itself taught a kind of patience. If you push it too hard, it stiffens. If you work it with quiet firmness, it yields and grows supple under the hands. No dijo nada de esto. She kept the lessons to herself, the way you keep smooth stones found by the water, not out of possessiveness, but because the moment to show them has not yet come. Only Brag, the old woman of the honeysuckle-covered house, seemed to read something in her face each time they crossed paths. One afternoon of clear sky and gentle wind, she found her collecting sage leaves behind her cottage. Bray's garden was small and yet seemed to contain half the island. There was mint, rue, fennel, foxgloves, chamomile, yarrow, wormwood, small clumps of heather, and white flowers whose name Ethna did not know. Everything grew with an ordered abundance, as though the plants obeyed a music that did not sound equally for everyone. Your footsteps no longer arrive before you, the old woman said, without turning. Aidna smiled. No sé si entiendo del todo lo que dices. Bridge cut another leaf, smelled it, and let it fall into her wicker basket. Before, you moved like someone pursued by last night and tomorrow night at once. Now you go where you are. Aithne was quiet for a moment. She liked that this woman spoke that way, as if naming things from a deeper place than ordinary words reach. The boat has taught me to breathe, she said at last. Bri turned then. In her grey eyes there was an ancient kindness, but also a precise attention, as if each word should be placed with care. No, she replied gently. The boat has helped you remember that you already knew. Aithne looked down at the plants wet with sun. The old woman went on speaking while she moved aside some dry branches. There is knowledge that does not enter through the head. It lives lower down, in the bones, in the blood, in the way the chest opens when no one commands it. The sea teaches that. Trees do too. Mothers when they lull their children, and certain boats sometimes when a person truly needs them. Aithne lifted her head sharply. Entonces, sí sabes de ella. Brigg did not answer at once. She pointed to a stone by the wall, and Aithne sat. The sun descended slowly over the hills. From there, a strip of ocean could be seen gleaming between the gorse and the tall grass. My grandmother saw it, the old woman said at last, and before her, her father's mother. It does not appear every generation, nor for everyone. People call it different things. Some say the breath boat, others the boat of the inner tides. My grandmother called it the oarless boat, and that is how I like to call it, because its secret is in that name. ¿Qué secreto? Brigg smiled faintly. Que no todo viaje necesita esfuerzo. Hay travesías que se hacen mejor soltando que empujando. The wind moved the sage leaves slowly. A bumblebee hummed between two white flowers and disappeared behind a hedge. Does it come from the other side? Aithne asked. The old woman tilted her head slightly. Todo viene del otro lado, si se mira de cierta manera. También la lluvia, también el sueño, también los recuerdos que regresan cuando uno está listo para albergarlos. Pero si me preguntas si pertenece al pueblo feérico, te diré que no del modo en que la gente suele imaginar. No es una trampa, no es un lazo, no es una deuda. Entonces, ¿qué es? Bragg lifted a sprig of fennel and crumbled it between her fingers. It is an ancient courtesy, a bridge, a form of help that the world offers from time to time. Just as there are springs where the water tastes of apple for reasons no one ever fully explains, just as there are hills where the wind sleeps before dawn, some things do not require to be understood in order to be true. Aithne let those words settle inside her. She looked for no more questions. She had learned that near certain truths, silence bears better fruit than impatient curiosity. Before leaving, Bragg held out to her a small linen pouch. Bálsamo de mejorana, lavanda y un poco de trébol de agua. Úntate una gota en las muñecas antes de acostarte. No porque lo necesites, sino para que recuerdes, incluso en casa, lo que el cuerpo ya ha aprendido. Aithne accepted it with gratitude. That night she carried the pouch with her to the cove. The sky was clear. The stars poured over the sea with unusual sharpness. The tide was rising slowly. The boat waited at the shore as always, pale under the light of a moon, now almost full. When she climbed in, Aithne found the white stone in its place, the blanket neatly folded, and beside both of them a small grey-blue feather, perhaps from a heron, perhaps from some seabird that crossed the coasts at dawn. She took it between her fingers. It was so light it seemed made of breath, more than of matter. She held it in her lap, and began the journey. That night the water was so still that at first the movement of the boat was barely felt. It was Aithna's own chest, rising and falling, that told her they were moving. She breathed gently and the hull glided over a surface so smooth that the stars reflected whole and unbroken, as though the sky had another sky beneath it. The young woman looked for a long while at that dark mirror. There was something deeply calming about seeing the constellations doubled, above and below, sky and water, light and reflection. She thought that sleep perhaps resembled that. Not a disappearance, but a deeper reflection of the waking world. A second room inside the same house, a place where things do not cease to exist, only grow softer at their edges. The boat carried her out to sea, but not very far. Far enough for the village to become a handful of shadows and the sound of the shore to thin until it nearly disappeared. Then it slowed. Aithna stopped looking at the horizon and watched the water around her. Fue entonces cuando lo vio. Each time she breathed out, a pale radiance rose beneath the surface, brief and diffuse, as though the sea were answering her breath with a flower of liquid light. When she breathed in, the glow faded. When she breathed out again, it returned. It was not a strong brightness. It was faint and bluish, like the light of certain jellyfish that sometimes came ashore after storms. Only finer, more spread out, like starlight dissolved in water. She tried breathing out more slowly. The light spread in a delicate line along the hull. She breathed in again, slowly, and released a long, round exhale. The line of light widened, drawing around the boat a circle that swayed gently before dissolving. Aithna smiled, almost like a child. She kept playing with the rhythm. Short exhales produced brief flashes. Deep, calm exhales spread mantles of light that lasted longer, as if the sea were celebrating the peace of the body with its own silent writing. Soon she stopped doing it out of curiosity and began to feel it as a conversation. The water answered, not with words but with presence, not with commands but with agreement. She breathed. The sea breathed with her, and the circle of light grew until it surrounded her entirely. En ese resplandor leve aparecieron figuras, not solid figures, not people of flesh and blood. They were more like forms suggested by the light beneath the water, as though old memories were passing slowly under the surface. Aithna made out first a hand, plaiting rushes, then the profile of a woman bent over a loom, then a child asleep on a blanket while a voice sang near the fire. The scenes did not last long. They came and went at the pace of the luminous waves, but all of them had one quality in common. They were wrapped in calm. The young woman felt no sadness at seeing them. She felt lineage. She understood that those visions did not belong only to her life. They were fragments of lives lived before, perhaps by women of her family, perhaps by other people of the coast, perhaps by persons whose stories had already dissolved into time and yet were still resting somewhere in the great memory of the world. No deeds appeared, no battles, no crowns. Hands appeared kneading bread, a shawl covering a child, an old woman closing shutters as the rain fell, a girl combing her younger sister's hair, a lamp lit at the edge of a bed. The sea was not showing her glory, it was showing her care. And then Aithna understood something that moved her more deeply than any wonder. To sleep, she thought, is not only a need of the body, it is also an inheritance of care. It is learned in the arms of others. It is received in the voice that lulls, in the hand that cradles, in the house where someone keeps watch so another can let go of waking. Rest is a form of trust passed from person to person, generation to generation, like songs for rainy days or bread recipes or the correct way to fold the blanket so it holds its warmth. Sus ojos se humedecieron otra vez, pero ya no con sorpresa. Exhaló. Then beneath the water there appeared a figure clearer than the others, a young woman with dark hair sitting by the fire holding a sleeping child against her chest. Her face could not be seen fully. only the curve of her cheek, a hand on the small back, the rocking motion. Aithne knew without need of certainty that it was her mother, or perhaps not exactly her mother, but the form in which her mother's love was still alive inside her. The vision lasted no more than a few breaths. Then the radiance dispersed and the sea was only sea again, though it would never be entirely only that. Aithne brought one hand to her chest. The grey-blue feather was still in her lap. She took it and laid it on the blanket with care, the way you leave an offering. She looked up. The stars continued to burn with their undisturbed distance, but they did not seem cold. They did not seem remote. She felt accompanied beneath them. The boat then began a new kind of movement, not toward the shore, not out to sea. It simply rocked in one place with an extremely slow, wide, almost ceremonial rhythm. At first, Aithne did not understand. Then she understood that the water did not want to carry her anywhere that night. It wanted to teach her to remain. That was more difficult than she had expected. Moving with her breathing was already natural to her. Following a gentle course was too. But staying still on the open sea, with no task other than to breathe and receive the night, woke in her a very old restlessness. Not fear, something more subtle. The feeling that if she did nothing, thought would fill everything again. That the mind would take advantage of the stillness to populate it with questions, memories, small nameless alarms. Y en efecto, durante unos minutos, así ocurrió. She remembered a debt of barley owed to a neighbor. She remembered the fence that had to be mended before winter. She remembered the well bucket that creaked too much on one side. She even remembered a childhood clumsiness that no one mentioned anymore. Thoughts came one after another, looking for room. This time, however, Aithne did not fight them. She watched them come, she let them be, and she returned to the rhythm of the water. Breathe in, breathe out. A thought would come, rock a moment, and then go like a twig on the tide. Another took its place, and that one went too. Gradually, she understood that her mistake of all those months had been believing that to sleep she had to empty her mind. The boat was showing her a kinder truth. There was no need to force anything empty. It was enough not to climb aboard each thought as though it were a boat of its own. She was already in a boat, and that was enough. The understanding made her smile in the middle of the night, alone above the starlit water. No teaching had ever seemed to her so simple or so deep. The boat kept rocking. The thoughts kept passing, but they weighed a little less each time. Some dissolved before they had fully formed. Others remained in the distance like faint lights seen from land. And after a time she could not measure. There was only the breath, the sea, the stars, the rocking. The body at last convinced that it did not need to chase or watch or arrange anything. It was in that state of wakeful stillness that she heard a new sound. It was not a song, it was not a human voice. It came from some distance, from the eastern side of the cove where the cliffs opened onto high meadows. It was a sound like a very low flute, played with an incredible gentleness. 3 notes, a pause, 2 more, then silence. It did not seem like a summons, more like a greeting made in passing. Aithne did not turn her head at once. She listened first to how the sound settled in the air and dissolved. Then she looked. Up on the meadow, outlined against the sky, there was a figure. She could not tell if it was a man or a woman, only a silhouette wrapped in a pale cloak, motionless beside an upright stone. The wind moved the cloth slowly. The figure raised a hand, or perhaps it was only a gesture of the cloak, and then it was gone. Aithne felt no bewilderment. In the world there were presences that did not always ask to be understood. Some only confirmed that one is not alone at the thresholds of rest, of sleep, or of memory, like the lights over the sea, like the white deer, like the voice in the mist. like the boat itself. The moon was already high when the boat began its return. This time the return journey was even more serene than usual. Aithne rested her head on the edge, cushioned by the blanket, and let her breath, learned and remembered, guide the final stretch. When the keel kissed the sand of the cove, she felt that a part of her was already asleep in the best sense, not absent, but surrendered to calm. Before stepping out, she took the blue-grey feather and set it beside the white stone in the bow. "Thank you," she whispered. She did not know whether she was speaking to the boat, the sea, her mother, the night, or all of those things at once. She climbed the path slowly. At the door of the house, before going in, she opened the small linen pouch Broy had given her and rubbed a drop of the balm on her wrists. The scent of lavender and marjoram rose gently, mingling with the faint smoke of the hearth. When she lay down, she did not try to repeat the night or hold on to its images. She only placed one hand on her chest, and she let the body heir to so many careful hands and so many forgotten songs, know on its own how to do the rest. As the nights passed, the presence of the boat stopped seeming like an isolated wonder and began to form part of the most intimate fabric of her life, like the well, the loom, or the distant bell of the cattle at dusk. Not because it had lost its mystery, but because some mysteries, when they are benevolent, end up becoming familiar without ceasing to be deep. Aithne no longer came to the cove with anxiety or hunger for signs. She came as someone visits a spring, as someone returns to a quiet room inside themselves where everything knows how to receive her. Autumn advanced, the mornings grew colder, bright rose hips appeared in the hedgerows. The heather began to fade into shades of red and ochre. The afternoons lit the meadows for a moment with a honeyed light before withdrawing early, leaving the village wrapped in peat smoke and in that particular inwardness of seasons that invite the fire, thick wool, and stories told in low voices. Aithne was sleeping well on nearly every night now. Sometimes she woke for a moment the way so many people do when the wind shifts or an ember breaks in the hearth. But now, opening her eyes in the dark, she did not find the old fear sitting beside her. She heard the house breathe. She heard her aunt stir barely in her sleep. She heard, further away, the sea. Then she remembered the rocking of the boat, rested her tongue on the roof of her mouth, softened her shoulders, and let a long exhale return the thread of rest. Sleep came back without a struggle, as simple as a blanket settling again over cold feet. That alone would have been enough to fill her with gratitude, but the boat kept teaching her. One afternoon that was particularly still, when the whole sky seemed made of a single white and luminous cloud, Aithne went with her aunt to the house of a neighbour named Nessa, who had just had a baby. The child was small and pink and slept curled in a basket by the fire with the complete seriousness of the newly arrived. Nessa had a tired and beautiful face. She spoke in whispers, as if the voice itself might ruffle the child's sleep. Aithne watched her as she lifted him to nurse. The mother's hand settled on the tiny back. It rose and fell very slowly with the rhythm Aithne already knew in her deepest self. The baby let out a small sigh. Everything in that scene, the warmth of the fire, the blanket folded over a chair, the shared breathing, the protective silence of the women gathered around, revealed to her again the nature of rest. It was not a command from the body. It was not a door you force open at the end of the day. It was a trust learned inside another trust. That night, going down to the cove, she carried that thought with her like a light wrapped in cloth. The boat was waiting at the shore. She climbed in. She took the white stone and found beside it something she had not seen before. A small piece of linen cloth embroidered with a single motif in blue thread. It was not a complex design, only a curve repeated 3 times, like 3 waves in a row, or like 3 breaths answering each other. Aithne ran her thumb across the embroidery. It reminded her of the rise and fall of water against the keel. It reminded her of Nessa's hand on the baby's back. It even reminded her of the way her mother, in the memory the sea had given back, had held her by the fire. She held the linen between her hands and began the journey. That night the boat did not set out immediately toward open water. It stayed a while in the widest part of the cove, rocking with an almost imperceptible rhythm. The water was grey-blue and smooth, with small darker streaks where the current changed direction. Aithne breathed as always, long and gently. The hull answered, and gradually sounds began to reach her from the shore. Not just the general murmur of sea and wind. She heard specific things: a door closing with care, the brief bark of a dog, a distant laugh, the knock of a bucket against stone, the single note of a flute or a shepherd's whistle, the crackling of a fire in some house. A song, barely a stretch of it, and silence. The young woman understood that she was hearing the village gathering itself in for the night. She had never paid attention that way before. Or if she had, it was with the impatience of someone afraid they won't be able to sleep, feeling that any sound might turn into an enemy. Now, by contrast, each of those sounds seemed to her a signal of shelter. Life settling down, hands finishing their last tasks, bodies preparing for rest. Even the distance between one sound and the next had something warm in it, as if the silence of the village were itself an inhabited silence. The boat then began to move very slowly along the shore, without drifting far. And Aithne, hearing those small proofs of human life in the night, understood something else. To sleep did not mean to be cut off from the world, but to surrender to a world that also knows how to gather itself in. She was not alone when she closed her eyes. She never had been. In every house, someone put out a light. In every stable, an animal grew still. In every nest, a head tucked under a wing. The whole island, in one way or another, was entering the great tide of rest. She kept breathing. The water carried her beyond the last visible house. The coast opened into meadows and ancient stones. On top of a rise stood a circle of lichen-covered rocks, so old that no one in the village knew for certain who had raised it. The children avoided playing there at dusk, not out of real fear, but out of respect. It was said that the wind changed its voice when it passed among those stones, and that on certain nights of the year you could hear music at their center, though no one was inside. The boat moved toward that part of the coast. Not toward solid ground, but toward the water in front of the stone circle. When it arrived, it stopped. Aithne looked up. The moon, now full, had risen high enough to illuminate the outline of every stone. The grass around them seemed silver. The air was completely still. Then she saw Bry. The old woman was standing inside the circle, wrapped in her dark cloak. She did not seem surprised to see her, nor did she make any gesture to beckon her. She simply placed a hand on one of the standing stones and looked out toward the sea, toward the boat, as though she had always known that on some night like this, the two of them would find each other at exactly that distance. Aithne did not try to draw closer. She understood that the scene required not movement, but attention. Bry began to sing. It was a very simple melody, so simple it seemed almost to have been born from a single sustained note, caressed in different ways. It did not have the floating mystery of the song Aithne had heard from Open Water the first time. It was a human song, low, earthy, a melody that could just as well have been sung to put a child to sleep, to watch over someone ill, or to accompany the last light in a winter kitchen. The sound traveled over the water without fading. Aithne closed her eyes. She breathed. The song and the breath entwined. No words were needed to understand the gift of that moment. The old woman was not revealing a secret or performing a solemn rite. She was confirming something, drawing a thread between the boat and the land, between the sleep learned on the water and the rest lived in the house, between the ancient magic of the world and the everyday kindness of people who care for one another. When she opened her eyes again, Bryce had finished the song. She stood a moment in silence. Then the old woman raised a hand and placed it on her own chest. Aithne did the same, in the boat. They exchanged nothing more than that gesture. And yet it was enough. The boat turned slowly and began its return. On the way back, the young woman felt something inside her close and open at the same time, like a door that, when it finally fits, lets through the right air. She understood that she would not always need the boat in the same way. That certainty did not sadden her. On the contrary, there was in it a mature sweetness, like the feeling of someone who has learned a song well and knows they will be able to hum it alone afterwards without ever forgetting from whom they received it. In the nights that followed, she kept going to the cove. The boat continued waiting for her, faithful and serene. Sometimes it carried her close to shore, sometimes out to open water. Sometimes it simply rocked her in silence. Other times it offered her, in the bow, a small token, a golden birch leaf, a small green stone, a sprig of heather in bloom out of season. Aithne no longer tried to interpret each one. She received them the way you receive signs from sky and earth, with gratitude without any need to possess them. And autumn leaned toward the dark time of the year. Samhain came. In the village, small fires were lit beside the doorsteps. Plates of oat bread and a little milk were left out for those who, on that thin night between worlds, might pass near the houses without doing harm. Families spoke more quietly. Some prayed, others told stories. Others simply built up the embers and left an empty chair close to the fire in case some beloved memory wished to sit for a moment. Aithne spent the evening with her aunt, sharing bread, thick soup, and good silences. When the moon was high, she wrapped herself in her shawl and went down alone to the cove. The air was cold, but not hostile. The night had that particular clarity of late autumn on the coast, when each star seems to be listening to itself. The boat was there, more luminous than ever. It did not shine in a supernatural way, but with a pearlescent paleness, as though all the moonlight had chosen to rest on its wood. Aithne climbed in and found the white stone, the blue blanket, and beside both of them, something that made her hold her breath for a moment. It was a strand of wool, grey-blue. Her mother used to wear one like it in her hair on windy days. Aithne la tomó con manos muy suaves. No lloró enseguida. Se sentó primero. She breathed. Sintió la barca responder. El agua comenzó a moverla hacia el centro de la ensenada. Once there, the sea was almost still. The young woman held the ribbon in her lap. The moon laid a serene path across the water. From the shore came very faintly the smell of Samhain smoke. Everything was gathered in. Everything seemed to wait with a benevolent patience. Then, at one side of the boat, a figure appeared. She did not rise from the water or descend from the sky. She was simply there, the way mist is sometimes there when you turn your head and cannot say at what moment it arrived. She was a young woman, seated in a boat identical to Aithne's, so close that the water between them was barely a breath. She wore dark hair gathered with a grey-blue ribbon. Her face was the face of someone you have loved before you could remember them clearly, and yet recognize at once. Her mother, or the form in which the world allowed her to be seen that night. She did not speak, nor did Aithne. It was not an apparition for questions or answers. It was a presence of rest. The woman smiled with a tenderness so ancient and still that Aithne felt loosen inside herself. A last thread of grief she had not even known was still pulled tight. The figure placed a hand on her own chest. Then she breathed out slowly. Aithne's boat answered with a gentle rocking. The young woman mirrored the gesture. In hello, ex-hello. For a time she could not measure, both boats remained like that, side by side, moving with the same breath. There was no separation, there was no loss, only a shared rhythm, a wordless teaching that said, "Here too there is home, here too you can rest. What you have received in love has not come undone. It is still in you, it is still rocking you." Aithne closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the other boat was gone. In the water there remained only the long reflection of the moon, and yet she felt no emptiness. She felt company. She felt that something had been settled for good. The oarless boat made its final return with a sweetness slower than ever. The cove received it. The keel grazed the sand. Aithne stood up, but before stepping down she understood, with a calm clarity, that this would be the last night. Not because the boat was leaving in anger, not because the gift was being withdrawn, but because the learning was complete. She smiled. She left the grey-blue ribbon folded beside the white stone. Then she added the small cloth embroidered with 3 waves, which she had carried in her pocket. Then she placed both hands on the smooth rim of the boat and gave silent thanks for everything she had received. The sleep returned, the breath remembered, the memory of her mother, the voice of the sea, the white deer, the iris lights, the song of bride, the certainty of never lying down alone again. She stepped down to the shore. She did not look back at once. She walked a few steps across the wet sand, feeling the faint cold of the water on her ankles. Then she looked back. The boat was gone. It had not drifted away. It was not sinking. Simply the place where it had rested was now only a strip of silver water, rising and falling with the pulse of the sea. Aithne stood still for a moment. Then she bowed her head, the way you bid farewell to a dear guest who knew when to leave. She climbed the path toward the village. The smoke from the hearths smelled of peat and bread. In a distant window, a warm light trembled. The Samhain night was still open, thin and deep, but it no longer seemed to her an uncertain threshold. It seemed to her a large, well-woven cloak spread over the island. When she came inside, her aunt looked up from the fire and asked nothing. She simply offered her a warm cup of milk with honey. Aithne drank it slowly. Then she lay down. She placed one hand on her chest, the other on her belly, and listened. The house breathed. The wind breathed in the eaves. The sea breathed behind the darkness. She breathed with all of it. Sleep came quickly, yes, but the most beautiful thing was that she no longer felt it as something arriving from outside. It was an inward tide, a familiar stillness, a serene water that had learned at last the way back. And from then on, through winters and springs, through rainy autumns and clear summer nights, Aithne slept with the humble confidence of someone taught by the sea. Sometimes when some worry pressed too hard on the day, or when a change of season made the body restless, she went down to the edge of the cove at dusk. Not to look for the boat, she never saw it again. She went only to sit on a rock, hear the water on the pebbles, and remember, take in air, let it go. Take in air, let it go. Over the years, other women from the village began coming to her when a child could not sleep, when a widow lay wakeful after a loss, when someone felt the night had grown too large. Aithne did not speak of enchanted boats or apparitions under the moon. She sat beside them. She taught them to notice the rise of the ribs. She placed a warm hand between their shoulders, if they allowed it. She told them to listen to the sea, even if they couldn't hear it from the bed. She spoke to them of the water, over the sand, of the waves that never hurry, of the rest that begins before sleep. And so, without naming it much, the gift kept traveling, the way songs travel, the way old recipes and simple blessings travel, the way a tenderness learned one night beside the water travels, offered then from hand to hand, from chest to chest, so that no one ever has to sleep entirely alone. Perhaps that is why, long afterwards, there were those who swore they had sometimes seen, uncertain clear misted dawns, a pale boat resting in the exact line where the tide kisses the sand and withdraws. No one knew where it came from. No one found oars or sail. Some said it was nothing but light on the water. Others swore they had seen it move on its own, almost at the rhythm of a human breath. Aithne, now older, never denied or confirmed anything. She only smiled. And when night came, she lay down without fear, listening inside herself to the deep rocking the sea had taught her. Like an invisible boat, like a cradle of water, like the whole world breathing slowly to help her rest.